Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you. Right, does everybody hear me okay? Is this mic okay? Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, yeah, thanks very much. Very nice to be here in Madrid. Very nice to be in this room, actually. I feel like I'm in the Mongolian steppe, and I've been herding my cattle all day long, and I've come home to my nice, warm, cozy yurt. So it's very nice. Yeah, very nice room. So I'm going to be talking today about GHG programs in the voluntary market, in the compliance market, and in the light of fragmenting markets, to talk about what happens next. The distinction between the compliance market and the voluntary markets is not quite as sharp as it has been. And so I'm going to talk about how these two markets are evolving and what kinds of things we might see next. And I think we've had a very nice introduction in the first presentation, and I'm going to dive into a bit more detail on some of the things that have been touched upon already. I work with the Verified Carbon Standard, so we're a GHG program. So that's what I'm doing every day, is working on the detail of how these GHG programs work, and that's what I'd like to talk about. Okay, this is what I'll be covering today. To start off, having a look at the clean development mechanism, having a look at the achievements under the CDM, an overview of the project activity that we have under the CDM, the project types, the methodology types, have a look at some of the shortcomings of the CDM. We've had a little bit of a look at some of those already. A quick roundup on what we've had from Cancun, and then leading into the Verified Carbon Standard to dive into some of the detail of how our program works and some of the recent developments under our program. Before going on to what might be termed next generation crediting models, to look at a couple of things specifically there. Standardized approaches to baselines and additionality. A lot of interest around this at the moment, and we're doing some work on that right now. And also jurisdictional and nested RED, to think about how avoided deforestation projects are going to work as we start to scale up from project RED towards more jurisdictional RED happening at the state and the provincial and eventually the national level, and how all that is going to work. But before we get into any of that, let's just remind ourselves why we bother with carbon markets at all. This is a cartoon from the Washington Post. It's the year 2060, and the search for a breakthrough technology to solve climate change continues. And the scientist, the rather large scientist at the side, is saying it's a time machine. We hope it'll take us back 50 years to when we should have put a price on carbon. And this is from the Washington Post from last year, at the time when all discussions on cap and trade unfortunately collapsed in the US. But it does serve to remind us what we're trying to achieve here, which is to put a price on carbon, and by pricing that externality into the cost of investment decisions, it helps the invisible hand of the market make decisions to invest in low carbon technologies. Let's have a look at the CDM then, and I'm going to run through a number of charts to have a look at what activity there has been under the CDM so far. These are the projects registered under the CDM, where they are. There are around 2,800 projects so far. A huge number of them in China, so 43% of projects in China, 22% in India, and also Vietnam, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia have been very strong beneficiaries of the CDM. So a lot of investment has gone into CDM projects, particularly in Asia. And in Asia, they've really run with the CDM, a lot of activity there. Also, Latin America, Brazil, and Mexico in particular have been a lot of investment into projects there. And the other thing to note from this particular chart is that Africa doesn't really feature here. And the CDM so far, despite great hopes that the CDM would be a great investment vehicle and a way of seeing development money into Africa, hasn't really been the case yet. There are a couple of interesting things which are starting to happen at the moment that might change that situation, and we'll touch on those in a bit. But so far, not a lot of CDM activity in Africa. This is issuance of certified emission reductions, CERs. So far, about 548 million CERs issued. So this is a lot of there's a lot of reductions. This is approximately the emissions, the annual emissions of Italy or of France. So the CDM so far has managed to reduce by the annual emissions of either of those two countries. So that's a significant number of emission reductions achieved so far. What this chart shows is the overwhelming proportion are in China, and that particularly serves to remind us why it has been very difficult to get the US on board with Kyoto Protocol. The concern of politicians and of the American people as manufacturing jobs leave the US, the concern being that it's because of China. We can obviously debate whether that's actually the case or not, but you can see in this chart why it's been very difficult to get the US to engage with the Kyoto Protocol and to be part of the international effort on climate change. This chart shows the project types that we have under the CDM. A huge proportion of them are renewable energy projects. 65% of projects are renewable energy projects. A lot of these are wind power projects, a lot of hydropower projects, and particularly in India and China for those two types of projects. A number of them are biomass projects. These are taking the waste product from sugarcane farming, the stem from the sugarcane, once it's been processed, taking that, combusting it, burning it to generate steam and to generate electricity to feed into electricity grids. There are very few solar power projects under the CDM so far. It remains that solar power technologies are very expensive technologies, and even with the carbon finance, the CDM hasn't been enough, and the carbon price isn't high enough to drive investment into solar. So with these renewables, we're talking about wind, we're talking about hydro, and about biomass, not solar yet. A couple of other project types that the CDM has been very successful in driving. Waste handling and disposal. These are landfill gas projects. A lot of these in countries like Mexico, where the landfill is full of organic matter. That organic matter is degrading anaerobically, i.e. in the absence of oxygen. And as it does that, it gives rise to methane emission, which rises from the landfill site. What these projects are doing are drilling wells into the landfill site, capturing that methane, and then they'll do one of two things. They may be flaring that, so combusting it, converting the methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas with 21 or 23 times the potential of CO2. So you combust that gas and create CO2. Or if you're not flaring it, you may be using it in a generator to generate electricity, and you're feeding that electricity into the electricity grid. So there you're doing two things. You're capturing the methane, avoiding that emission, and you're also generating electricity and displacing electricity that might otherwise have been produced from a coal-fired power station. The orange slice at the top is livestock projects, biogas projects. These are projects capturing, taking manure from poultry farming, from cattle or from pig farming. And under the baseline scenario, the business as usual is to take all of that manure, put it in very large lagoons, large swimming pools, if you like, where it degrades and again releases methane into the atmosphere. So instead, what these projects are doing is taking that manure, putting it into an anaerobic digester, as it's called. It's a large encapsulated space where you can control the temperature and again capture the methane in a controlled manner, and then you'll take that methane and combust it to generate electricity, and again feed that into the grid. There's three other interesting things to note from this chart where there hasn't been too much activity under the CDM. The first is transport projects, which we just had a question on. The transport sector hasn't seen a lot of projects under the CDM at all, in part because of the dispersed nature of the emissions, and partly which makes it difficult to quantify them and makes it difficult to monitor and verify them. And also some ownership issues over who owns the carbon credits. Is it the person who created the biofuel Is it the person who's driving the truck? Is it the person who's selling the biofuel that's somewhere in the middle of the chain? Energy demand takes 1.2% of the slice here. That's a very small number. These are energy efficiency projects. The kinds of energy efficiency projects that we have under the CDM are many of them waste heat recovery projects at cement plants. So you capture the waste heat and you're doing something with that rather than just letting that waste heat go to the atmosphere. But apart from that, there aren't many energy efficiency projects under the CDM, which might strike us as a bit odd because there are so many opportunities for energy efficiency. The challenge under the CDM has been the way that the CDM approaches additionality, which predominantly is a financial analysis to see that the project needed the money to make the project happen. But if you've got an energy efficiency project, if you're familiar with the McKinsey cost curve, all the energy efficiency stuff is far on the left-hand side. It saves you money. So if a project is saving you money, it's quite difficult to make the case that you need carbon finance to make the project happen. That said, it constantly amazes me how inefficient we are with energy. And there are many reasons why people are not taking steps to improve the efficiency of their industry, of their homes, of the buildings that we're in and out of every day. And so these things are not happening. So clearly there needs to be some kind of impetus, and so therefore it's, to me, certainly it seems you should have carbon projects around these things, but energy efficiency has been quite a tricky one under the CDM. The other big slice that is missing is agriculture, forestry, and other land use, AFLU, as we call it for short. There's a small slice here, afforestation, reforestation, which is less than 1%, but emissions from the land use and land use change and forestry sector are around 25 to 30% of global emissions. And yet a very, very small slice here. Under the CDM, afforestation, reforestation is eligible, but there are many other things that are not eligible. RED, avoided deforestation, improved forest management, anything to do with agriculture, storage of carbon in soils, and so on. That doesn't really feature here at all. These are the types of methodologies that we have under the CDM. There are 92 approved methodologies. These are the large-scale methodologies. There are a number of small-scale methodologies as well. And there's quite an even distribution here. We can see plenty of methodologies for energy demand, for energy efficiency, and we can see methodologies for the transport sector. And we can even see methodologies for afforestation, reforestation. There are a number of those. But these are methodologies that have been approved, but are not being used very widely. Let's have a look at the achievements under the CDM then. So significant number of emission reductions achieved, a good number of projects and a good number of CERs issued. And there's been significant investment into developing countries. So particularly India and China, as we saw. And the way in which wind power projects and biomass projects are developed in those countries now has been transformed by the CDM. Most wind power projects in India and China will now be developed with carbon finance, a wholesale transformation of those industries in those countries. Likewise for Brazil, biogas and biomass projects, and for Mexico, landfill gas projects and biogas projects, a wholesale transformation of the way that those projects are funded in those countries. The CDM has been very successful in building capacity. Developing a carbon project is not a straightforward thing. And so the CDM has built all of that capacity so that we now know how to develop projects. We now know how to do validation of projects, how to do verification of emission reductions, and how the accreditation systems work to accredit the validators and the verifiers so they can do that validation and verification. There's been development of registries. So we've got registries that are holding these certified emission reductions. We've got exchanges where you can buy and sell secondary CERs. So a lot of that infrastructure has been developed on the back of the CDM. And we've established a carbon price. and there is confidence in carbon trading. For all the ups and downs of the secondary CER market or the allowance market in the European Union, there is now confidence in carbon trading, and it works. So those are the achievements of the CDM. There are shortfalls in the CDM, things that it could do better, and a commentator recently called it the conservative and discouraging mechanism, the CDM, which I think is a little bit unfair. But the CDM, there are some things, some shortfalls in the CDM. The volume and scale, there have been significant emission reductions, but if we're to keep reductions down to, if we're to keep temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, then the CDM will need to scale significantly, or other programs will need to scale significantly to meet that challenge. And the CDM so far hasn't shown itself capable of scaling to a point where it can meaningfully address climate change. We heard already a little bit about the speed of project registration and of CER issuance. It's a huge bugbear for those that are developing projects, that it takes so long for them to get their projects through the process. And taking that amount of time going through the process costs them money, and it very much impacts their long-term appetite to play in the game, to be developing projects under the CDM. The evaluation of projects on a project-by-project basis is a challenge under the CDM. We're talking here about additionality. And the way that additionality mostly works under the CDM is for the project developer to make the case as to why it needs carbon finance. And then on the flip side, the project validator and the CDM executive board have got to figure out whether this project needed the carbon finance. And we have the CDM additionality tool, which is a stepwise procedure for how the project developer is going to make the case and how these guys are going to evaluate it. But essentially what you have here is an asymmetry of information. These guys know full well whether they needed the carbon finance or not, and these guys have got to figure out whether they're telling the truth or not. And so this becomes a very inefficient process, and it becomes a process that has an uncertain outcome. And there are different ways that we can approach additionality that may be better than that. Project type, project scope, we saw already the kinds of projects that the CDM has not been successful with. There are things like transport energy efficiency that are included under the scope of the CDM, which have not had traction, and there are other large sectors which are not included at all under the CDM: agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Also ozone depleting substances. This is the kind of activity that you can have under the VCS, under the Climate Action Reserve, the program in California, but which are not eligible under the CDM. And transparency it has also been an issue under the CDM. The access for project developers to speak to the UNFCCC Secretariat has not been there, and that's been very problematic for those project developers. Executive board decision-making is not that transparent, and the CDM doesn't yet have an appeals process. So these are some of the shortfalls of the CDM, but the reform that came out of Cancun, I think, surprised a lot of us. A lot of good steps forward there, progress with the CDM. I won't go too much into these because we touched on this already on the previous presentation. But the executive board is now given the go-ahead to develop an appeals process, and we hope to see that by the end of this year. The UNFCCC Secretariat will be opening itself up so that stakeholders can speak to them directly instead of having to, at the moment, what they have to do is communicate through the validation verification bodies. The crediting of projects will be given from the date on which the documentation is submitted for registration, which means that once you submit the documentation, you start accruing credits from that time, which means even if your project then takes a year or 2 years even to go through the registration process, you haven't lost those credits. You'll be getting credit straight away. The green light has been given for the standardization in methodologies, and the CDM methodologies panel which is a group within the CDM that looks at methodologies, will be looking at 80% of those methodologies to see where standard default factors can be used, and potentially, and I think this one is a bit further out there, to look at standardized approaches to baselines and additionality. Carbon capture and storage, again, a green light given on that. A lot of difficult issues to deal with under carbon capture and storage, but at least the green light's been given. So these are all reforms under the CDM, and that's all good progress, but what we're still missing is international agreement on binding targets. So that leaves the future of the CDM a little bit uncertain, and we've got our two polar bears here who are on these ever-shrinking little icebergs, and from the time of Copenhagen, there's just been a lot of uncertainty, and so it's, the one polar bear's got his iPhone 4 taking a call saying it's Copenhagen. They're asking if we can hang on for another 12 months. And so they hung on for another 12 months, and they got to Cancun, and the icebergs were getting smaller and smaller. And again, great progress from Cancun, and Cancun really has restored faith in the international negotiations, very good progress on CDM reform. But we don't have, in the near term and the medium term, any real prospect of an international binding agreement on emissions, which leaves the carbon markets in a situation where, really starting from Copenhagen, it became quite clear that they were starting to fragment. For many years, we've been working to this idea that we would have one unified carbon market and that everything would happen under the Kyoto Protocol and under its three flexibility mechanisms, the CDM, joint implementation, and international trading. And from Copenhagen, it becomes apparent that it's not going to be that straightforward. And what we see now are a number of carbon markets in various parts of the world emerging as governments and as regions want to get on and do something. And so, for example, we have the Japanese who are not playing anymore in the Kyoto and the CDM game, somewhat turned their back on that to pursue bilateral arrangements with specific countries and to look at other ways of crediting projects other than the CDM. And so they're looking at 30 or so particular projects that will potentially not use the same kind of approach that the CDM uses. We've got cap and trade schemes emerging in places like South Korea. The Californians are pressing ahead under Assembly Bill 32 and are just putting together what their cap and trade scheme will look like. Also in the US, the Western Climate Initiative, which is a number of US states coming together with a number of Canadian provinces on a cap and trade scheme. In the northeast of the US, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and trade scheme covering the power sector. In Australia, we have a cap and trade scheme on its way, being developed right now, and a core part of that is what they're calling the Carbon Farming Initiative. And this is a way for the agriculture sector and the forestry sector to generate credits to feed into their cap and trade scheme. And then, of course, we have the voluntary programs like the Verified Carbon Standard, the Gold Standard, the Climate Action Reserve. So a number of different kinds of markets emerging, which is going to be interesting to watch it unfold. And then at some point, they're all going to need to come back together. So it's in that context I'd like to talk about the Verified Carbon Standard and what we're doing to go into the structure and some of the recent developments under the VCS. The VCS is established by 4 leading NGOs: the International Emissions Trading Association, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Climate Group, and the World Economic Forum. And these guys came together around 2005 when there was a lot of uncertainty in the voluntary market, talks of the Wild West, of carbon cowboys, of there really being no standards that were applied to credits in the voluntary market. And these guys were actually concerned that would then impact the compliance markets, the CDM, that the EU emissions trading scheme would be impacted by the lack of credibility in the voluntary market. So these guys came together, put together the VCS with 3 objectives in mind. The first is a around creating a global benchmark for carbon, creating a fungible unit, the verified carbon unit, as we call it, and to create a platform that gave confidence to investors to invest into these types of carbon projects in the voluntary market. The second objective is to foster innovation within a context of quality, credibility, and transparency. The CDM, the compliance markets are somewhat rigid, and so they can be constrained by what kind of innovation they can bring forward. And there's many ways to innovate, whether it's with new types of project, and the AFALU part of what we do being a very central and important part of what we do that's not covered by the CDM, but also ways of innovating about how you put your program together. Are there ways to make a GHG program more efficient and more scalable than the CDM currently is? The last goal is to demonstrate workable frameworks to feed into compliance regimes. So while we're innovating, while we're putting together our GHG program, we'd like to see that work adopted by compliance regimes, all these fragmented markets that are emerging, rather than them reinventing the wheel every single time they are creating their own market and their own program. So we'll be speaking, and we speak to the Carbon Farming Initiative folks in Australia as they're developing their program. We were in California last week speaking to the Air Resources Board in California as they're putting together their program to see what elements of the VCS they can use as they start to put their programs together. The VCS Association is a non-profit organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. We do one thing, which is to manage and develop the program. And we're also very clear on what we don't do. We're not offering consulting services. We don't develop projects. We are not involved in methodology development. And we don't do validation verification. Our funding comes from the issuance of credits into our registry system. So there's a levy charged on each VCU that's issued, and that's what funds us. We also have some foundation grants for specific initiatives that we're working on. This is the history of the development of the VCS. We launched version 1 in March of 2006 and issued a second version 6 months after that. Those two versions were consultation versions to get very wide input and feedback to then lead into the steering committee that drafted the VCS 2007 version, which we launched in November of 2007. And a year after that, we formally included the agriculture, forestry, and other land use requirements into the VCS in November of 2008. We're currently working on VCS version 3. It'll be released in about 3 weeks' time at the beginning of March. We put that out to public consultation again. Had a great response of 38 submissions with 480 individual comments within them, which has been very useful in helping us work further on the standard. The focus of this release is to further improve the clarity of the program, to make it more user-friendly, and to include specific requirements on certain areas. We've implemented a complaint and appeals process, for example, and we've also included specification for grouped projects, which is the same concept as the program of activities under the CDM, which has a lot of potential. This is the concept of taking a project at its initiation with an initial group of activities, and then it may be that you want to add activities into that project as you move through the second, the third, the fourth, and through to the 10th year. So a classic example of that would be a cook stove project in Eastern Africa, where you've got a cook stove that you're working with in a certain district and rolling it out in a certain district. And then as you move through the years of the project, you want to include further districts as you're doing more work in other areas. And the grouped project approach allows you to do that. And under the classic approach, you need to identify all of your project activities at the start of the project. This approach, on the other hand, allows you to add in those activities as you move through the project. This is the structure of the program. At the center of it sits the standard itself, And the whole program is based on ISO 14064, which gives a very solid grounding for creating a program. And that's also very useful. The Climate Action Reserve has as its basis ISO 14064. And so if you have these programs that are all built on the same building blocks, then that really helps to stitch them together later on. The standard sets out the requirements for how you develop your project, how you develop your methodologies, and how you validate your project and verify your emission reductions. So the standard kind of gives you it's like a recipe, if you like, and it gives you just a recipe. At this point, you haven't got any infrastructure, you haven't got a whole GHG program, and that's where the other parts come in here. You need methodologies, so we have a process for approving methodologies under the program. It's a bottom-up approach, so we have people will develop methodologies and bring them to us. We then post them for a 30-day public comment period on our website, and it then goes on to a stage of independent assessment by 2 validation verification bodies. So you've had 2 sets of eyes looking at this methodology. All the documentation then comes to us, and we give it a final review, and we'll approve it. And I'll have a look in a moment about the kinds of methodologies we have being developed under the VCS. You need an accreditation system. You need validation verification bodies that are going to do project validation and verification of the emission reductions. And so it's important that any GHG program has a verification system. Under the VCS, we have validation and verification done by designated operational entities that are accredited under the CDM. And we also have a program with the American National Standards Institute, which does accreditation in a number of areas and also has an accreditation for GHG programs as well. So we have the DOEs, but then we have a whole set of other validation verification bodies doing work as well. And the last bit is a registry system. And once you've got all of these pieces, now you've got a whole program. You haven't just got the recipe, but you've also got your oven, you've got your chef, you've got your shop window where you can sell these things, where you can see these things as well. The registry system is a multi-registry system. We have at the center of it the VCS project database. That's essentially a piece of software that we run that gives the public access to all of the project documentation. It issues the serial numbers of the verified carbon units, the VCUs, and ensures uniqueness of projects across the 3 registries. And then the 3 registries are the ones that the project developers interact with when they want to come and register their projects. The benefits of a multi-registry system are that you've created this competitive situation where you've got 3 registries that are all busy. They're all slightly different types of organizations and bring slightly different things to the market, and they're busy competing to ensure that they bring the right kind of service and the right kind of price point to their customers. You've also got a scalable system, which means as and when you get to any kind of capacity constraint within this system, you can add in a further registry. And that might be a registry in Brazil, or it might be a registry in South Korea. So you can make the registry system relevant to the different regions where the VCS might be being used. This is what the registration and issuance process looks like. The project developer or the project proponent will take a methodology if one exists for what they want to do, and if one doesn't exist, they'll take the methodology. They'll create a new methodology and take that through the approval process. They write a project description. The project description describes what the project looks like, what kind of technology it's implementing, whereabouts it is. It makes the case for additionality. It sets out what the baseline scenario is and what the project is going to be doing that affects that baseline scenario. It talks about the data and parameters that will be monitored so that the emission reductions can be quantified. They then engage a validation verification body to do a validation of the project. And then as you go through the first, the second, the third years on a periodic basis, the project developer is writing a monitoring report which talks about the activity for the year, quantifies the emission reductions for the year, and that is verified by a validation verification body. All of that documentation can then come to one of our registries. The registries will do a completeness check on all of that documentation to register the project and issue the units. And this is what a verified carbon unit does, what the attributes it needs to have. It needs to be a real reduction, which means that it's a reduction that's happened. It can't be a reduction that may happen in the future. So if you have an afforestation, reforestation project, we're not talking about the carbon that will be sequestered in those trees going forward. We're talking about carbon that has been sequestered in those trees already. It needs to be measurable, which means it's used a recognized methodology and there's a recognized way of quantifying the emission reductions. It needs to be permanent. That's particularly relevant to AFLU projects where there is a risk of reversal. And the way that we handle that is we have what we call a pooled AFLU buffer account, which means that when AFLU projects have their emission reductions and removals quantified, we have a risk tool which sets out how they assess the non-permanence risk, the reversal risk associated with the project. And based upon that, they will need to put, depending on what the end figure is from that risk assessment, they'll need to put between 20 and about 40% typically of their credits into our pooled buffer account. And then that pooled buffer account serves as an insurance mechanism so that if there is a reversal at any one of the projects, we have this pool of credits which we can draw upon to ensure against that reversal risk and ensure that the environmental integrity is maintained. The VCU needs to be additional, and it needs to be all of these other things here: independently verified, transparently listed, uniquely numbered, and conservatively estimated. So this is some of the activity under the VCS at the moment. We've issued 52 million VCUs to date, and so this is about 10% of what the CDM has issued so far, from around 557 projects so far. And we also issued from last week the first red credits. So this is a very exciting development under the VCS, the first red credits that have been issued to any credible third-party standard. These were issued to an avoided deforestation project in Africa. So that's a tremendous milestone for red. The new types of projects that we're setting out requirements for at the moment include peat rewetting and conservation. Those requirements will be included in March. These are requirements for projects particularly relevant to avoided deforestation projects in places like Borneo, elsewhere in Southeast Asia, where there's very deep peat soils, and the peat contains a lot of carbon. The typical baseline scenario is deforestation, conversion to oil palm, and when you're converting to oil palm, draining the peat, then the peat oxidizes. A lot of that carbon then escapes to the atmosphere. So this is what those requirements are focused on. We're also working on avoided conversion of ecosystems. These are projects which are grassland projects, for example, that would be converted to agriculture. When you convert grasslands or pasture land across to agriculture, then you lose a lot of carbon in that process. And also for this year we have wetlands under study, so-called blue carbon. A lot of carbon in wetlands, and wetlands in places like Louisiana are very threatened. And so us including requirements and allowing wetlands would allow for projects in places like that. And carbon capture and storage we'll look at this year as well. These are some of the methodologies that we have developing under the VCS at the moment. I'll focus particularly on the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. We have approved 4 red methodologies so far, and there are a further 5 under development. And there are many. The reason for having a number of methodologies certainly at this stage, we're sort of at the stage where we need to see 1,000 flowers bloom, see which methodologies work, which approaches are workable approaches. And there are many different types of driver for deforestation. It might be happening in a mosaic pattern where you've got deforestation happening in pockets across the forest. It might be a frontier type of deforestation where a new road is put in and then deforestation is occurring sort of more in a linear pattern. It might be deforestation due to planned activities such as conversion to oil palm. So there are many different drivers of deforestation, many different ways in which deforestation is happening. And so that's why we see many different types of methodologies here. Also worth noting the agriculture methodologies that we've got coming through here. For example, there are four methodologies here, and the agriculture sector will be very important if we're to bring forward cap and trade in certain areas, certain regions, in particular places like Australia and the US, where the farming lobby is very strong. And so if we can provide a way for these kinds of projects to happen in the farming sector, then it brings the farmers along with the whole concept of cap and trade and of offsetting, which... Right, okay.
We need you to use this.
Okay, thanks. So having methodologies and having projects in the agricultural land management sector will be very beneficial in terms of bringing farmers and bringing many rural communities into the fold. So lastly, I wanted to have a look at what we're calling next generation crediting models. A couple of things here, the standardized approaches to baselines and additionality, and also to have a look at jurisdictional and nested red. So standardized approaches, there's a couple of things to talk about here, technology tests and performance benchmarks. The technology test is actually a fairly simple concept, also called a positive list, and it's a way of demonstrating additionality, a way of greatly simplifying our approach to additionality. We have one example so far. There's a CDM tool for providing an approach, technology test approach to additionality for micro-scale projects. So these are very small-scale renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects. And the way that this tool works is to set out essentially criteria, and if you meet these criteria, then you're deemed as additional. So you don't go through this process of using an additionality tool to establish why you need the carbon finance or how you need the carbon finance. Instead, all of that work has been done up front. The idea is that it's been done up front in the technology test, in the methodology itself, or in this case, in the tool, to say that these technologies are additional because the work has been done to establish that they're additional. So the CDM tool, which was issued in May of this year, says that for micro-scale energy efficiency and renewable energy, if your project is in a least developed country or a small island developing state, or if it's off-grid, or if each one of your generation units is less than 750 kilowatts of capacity, or if your host country or the CDM executive board has approved the technology as an additional technology, then you're automatically deemed as additional. So it's a very simple approach, and there should be a lot of potential for taking a very simple approach like this. The challenge is to do probably a little bit more work than the CDM tool does, to do that work up front to establish what are the criteria that make your technology additional. And it's really this last point on the list here that's where more work needs to be done. And in some senses, the CDM sort of kicked the ball into the opposition's court, if you like, by saying that it needs to be the host country or the CDM executive board needs to approve the technology. And so far, host country designated national authorities don't really know what to do with this. There's certainly a lot of prospect for this approach, but the DNAs don't really know what makes a project type or a technology type additional. And so work will need to be done, more work will need to be done than just this tool to help the DNAs create lists of technologies that could be deemed additional. I mean, it's certainly very useful to set out that it needs to be in an LDC or a small island developing state and all of these other kinds of criteria, but you need to think about other things such as when does a technology become common practice? And you want to take into consideration what is the market penetration of that technology. So you might say that you could have a technology, it's a solar power technology, it's in implementation in rural households that are off-grid, and once market penetration gets to 20%, then you can consider that that is becoming common practice and it's no longer eligible under a technology test. But that's kind of the next stage of work that needs doing here that the CDM tool hasn't quite done yet, but the tool is certainly a very useful start. The other part of performance benchmarks is, the other part of standardized approaches is looking at performance benchmarks. And there's been a little bit of work on this so far. There is one performance benchmark methodology approved under the CDM. It's a performance benchmark approach for energy efficient domestic refrigerators. And this diagram here is taken from the work that the Cement Sustainability Initiative, which is an initiative under the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, is doing to develop a performance benchmark approach for the cement sector. So the way that it works is the performance benchmark can be used for demonstrating additionality and also for the quantification of emission reductions. You set a benchmark at a certain rate of emissions per, in this case, ton of cement produced. And the benchmark here is set at the level of the red line. We've got 3 cement plants, A, B, and C. In terms of demonstrating additionality, A is already producing cement more efficiently than the benchmark. It is beneath the benchmark. So it, because it's producing cement below that benchmark level, is already additional. So it's deemed as additional. B is a slightly less efficient plant, but it implements technology to make itself more efficient and manages to reduce emissions to beneath the benchmark. So it also is deemed additional because it's managed to reduce beneath the benchmark. Plant C, on the other hand, is implementing reductions, implementing a technology that's leading to reductions. It certainly reduces, but it still remains an inefficient plant. It doesn't manage to reduce itself beneath the benchmark. So in this case, because it doesn't get to the benchmark, it's not used both for establishing additionality and for quantifying the emission reductions. So why are these standardized approaches useful? They increase efficiency and reduce transaction costs. With both performance benchmarks and for technology tests, you're putting a lot of the thinking into the methodology itself, which means that work is done to apply the methodology and to develop your project and take it through the validation process. You've streamlined that process a lot more. You've also created certainty for the project and for the investors in that you've stated up front what are your criteria for additionality and what are your criteria for quantifying the emission reductions. And by doing that, the project knows and the investor knows right up front whether the project will be successfully registered or not. In the case of a technology test, you know whether it meets with the requirements of the technology test right at the beginning. So you know whether you've got a project in front of you or not. And likewise with the performance benchmark approach, you know what the emission reductions are that you're at right now, and you know what emission reductions you can achieve, and so you know whether you qualify or not. The performance benchmark approach also allows for the crediting of a range of measures within a single methodology. There are many ways that you might want to get yourself down to that benchmark. There's a methodology under the VCS which is for energy efficiency in homes. And there are a number of ways that you can make a home more efficient. You might be installing double glazing. You might be installing more loft insulation. It might be that you're switching appliances, refrigerators and so on, to install more efficient appliances. And working out the additionality for each one of these individual measures is going to be very problematic, very costly, if not impossible. Instead, if you're using a performance benchmark approach, what you're doing here is saying, we don't really mind, and we don't even care what measures you're implementing so much as are you getting down to the performance benchmark? And whatever you can do, whatever measures you implement to bring yourself down to that performance benchmark, then those can be credited for. And that's not the case under the existing way that methodologies work, which is to say you have to make the case for additionality for each of the measures, the double glazing, the loft insulation, the switching of appliances, and you have to look at each of those separately, which is definitely problematic. Lastly, these standardized approaches can be a useful stepping stone. They will be a useful stepping stone to get us to crediting mechanisms that use national or sectoral baselines and towards nationally appropriate mitigation action approaches. If we're going to have crediting that scales up from the project by project basis, and we're going to have crediting that look for what's happening across a sector or what's happening across a region, then we're going to need some way to get there from our existing methodologies, which are very much focused on the project by project approach. So standardized approaches are very useful in that respect. There are a number of challenges, particularly with performance benchmarks. The data requirements can be very onerous. You need to understand what is the performance of your sector. So this is okay for certain sectors like the cement sector, the aluminium sector, power, steel. These sectors have quite strong industry associations that have collected a lot of data from their members and have quite reasonable data sets. But that's not the case for all sectors, and certainly not the case for all regions. Again, we have this divide between data available in industrialized countries versus developing countries. So the data requirements are certainly going to be a challenge to think about. You need to think about what is the appropriate level for your benchmark. The cement methodology uses a figure of 20%, which actually comes from the Marrakesh Accords. The Marrakesh Accords set out that 20% was the top 20%, the 20th percentile. Those top 20% of performers in a sector are top performers. So that's certainly useful. We've got this figure of 20%, but that's also rather arbitrary, and nobody really knows where that 20% figure came from. It might be a good number, but is 10% or is 30% the right number? And it's going to vary from sector to sector and from region to region. There are a number of questions like, should the benchmark be different for new versus existing facilities? And a new facility is in a far better position to take advantage of new technologies, of more efficient technologies. And existing facilities are going to be less efficient. But you want to make sure that you leave in incentivization so that these existing facilities can be incentivized to retrofit, to make their facilities more efficient. But if you set the benchmark only at one level, then all of your new facilities would qualify, and there wouldn't be enough incentive, and your existing facilities just wouldn't be able to implement enough retrofit technology to ever get them up to the standards of the new facilities. But that's not to say that we don't want the existing facilities to be part of the game. So you've got to think about that one. And you also want to think about whether the benchmark is to be adjusted during the project crediting period. And that will depend on your sector. Some sectors are moving quite quickly to become more and more efficient. And if that's the case, you may want to ratchet down your benchmark to make sure that you're continuing to drive the sector into as much energy efficiency as is potential in that sector. It might be that there are other sectors where technology's sort of reached a bit of a plateau, in which case you may not want to adjust the benchmark during the project crediting period. So what is the VCS doing on all of this? We've put together a steering committee to start to frame rules and requirements and specifications on standardized approaches. And we've established a steering committee through an open call for members, and they've started working with them at the end of last year. We had a great response to the call for members. We've put together a fantastic team of 15 people who are representing various industries, have various technical expertise. We have NGO representation. We have the author of the only performance benchmark methodology approved under the CDM, the author of the cement methodology that we looked at. We also have 3 members of the CDM methodologies panel on the steering committee as well. So it's great to see their interest in what we're doing and to have them input into the process, and will also be an opportunity for us to feedback what we're doing into what the CDM is doing on standardized approaches to baselines and additionality. The working groups we've created, we've broken that steering committee down into various working groups that are having a look at what lessons there are from existing work, what the overarching principles should be for performance benchmarks and technology tests. We've got one group looking at technology tests, because I think that is an area where we could probably move quite quickly. And the challenges there are not quite as great as the challenges on performance benchmarks. And then we have one further group looking at the broader context to make sure that what we do is relevant and feeds into what's happening on national and sectoral crediting, what's happening on NAMAs and so on. We're very keen to make sure that what we do is a useful stepping stone for those 2 big pieces as well. The output from the group will be subject to peer review and stakeholder consultation, and we expect the first deliverables out in the second half of this year. So that brings us to the last piece that I wanted to look at, which is jurisdictional and nested RED. And there are 2 parts to this. We're talking about RED projects. And we have this evolving situation right now where in places like Brazil and Indonesia, there are a number of RED projects that are starting to butt up against each other. These are projects that are being developed by separate project developers. They will use as their baseline the region as the reference area. So you've got 2 separate projects, but they're both using and trying to establish a baseline across the same region. So there are 2 problems with that. One is that it's inefficient, because you're having 2 projects having to create essentially the same piece of work. The other concern or question is really one of environmental integrity. If they both determine these baselines, but they determine them differently, then the quantification of emission reductions is different for each project. And so now you have an issue of environmental integrity. So what we need to do is to set out a process for developing regional baselines and for having these registered under the VCS. And we've put together an advisory group to work on this and the next piece that I'll talk about. And the advisory group is composed of technical experts, but also a lot of representation from states in Brazil, from Indonesia, from Colombia, to figure out how all of this can work. The regional baselines need to be informed by project developers, by technical experts, and by these states and provinces. So it can't be a regional baseline that one single project developer puts together. It needs to be very much developed as part of a multi-stakeholder process, which again is different from how methodologies and projects work right now. But at the end of that, you've got project-based accounting. You've got one single reference area, one regional baseline, but you're still crediting to the project. So the next step then is to have a look at how you do accounting and crediting at the jurisdictional level. So you've got your regional baseline, but crediting of RED projects is also a sovereignty issue. And so the states and the provinces want to step in so that they can be involved in running the program, in accounting for the credits and so on. And also having this kind of approach means that you can have projects driving things forward, but it might also be that the state or the provincial government wants to implement a number of policies itself, which is slightly different from a project. It's a policy measure, and those policy measures can now be credited if you're accounting for the reductions across the whole region in a jurisdictional way. So the process for this is to set out requirements. They're going to need to take account of a number of different things here. We need a way of accounting for emission reductions across the whole jurisdiction. You need to set out what the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements are going to be for issuing credits at the jurisdictional level. There are issues of risk management to address potential underperformance and non-permanence risk. And you also need to account for leakage. So it's no good avoiding something happening here if something just pops up somewhere else. And of course, you need to account for the additionality of the activities that are happening under this approach. So I'm going to leave it there. So thanks very much for your attention. And yeah, very happy to take questions that you've got.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for your presentation. We can take a couple of questions. Here we have... ¿Tenemos un micrófono aquí? Ahí.
Yeah, I was quite surprised that actually you presented under the CDM quite a lot of big percentage of technologies leading or methodologies leading with afforestation, reforestation. And then most of the projects that they make use of this methodologies, it's a very little number actually under the CDM project. And then with your VCS project, you actually presented that you're going into the direction of developing more methodologies into this this area of afforestation, reforestation, even from the ecosystem conservation. So you think this situation where this afforestation, reforestation projects are not so important now, it's changing in the next few years?
Yeah, am I understanding your question to be about what's happening with afforestation, reforestation under the CDM
future.
And why it hasn't been successful under the CDM?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, there are a number of methodologies under the CDM for afforestation, reforestation. Excuse me. The challenge for afforestation, reforestation projects under the CDM has been the way in which they're credited. And because of the permanence issue, there are different ways that you can handle that. Under the BCS, we take a pooled buffer approach where we essentially self-insure, and all projects have to pay into this buffer. But it means that when the credits are issued, the credits that are issued are permanent, and they can't be taken away. The approach of the CDM, on the other hand, was to issue temporary credits, which means that from your afforestation, reforestation project, you have something called TCER, a temporary CER, which is good for 10 years. Good for 5 years. At the end of those 5 years, whoever holds that credit then needs to replace it with something else, another TCER or a regular CER. So the challenge there is that if you're a buyer, you've paid for something, but you're going to have to pay in the future for something else again. And that situation means that the pricing that we're seeing at the moment for TCERs is lower than the price for VCUs from VCS AFLU projects. And that's why, really the main reason why there really hasn't been that much traction on afforestation, reforestation under the CDM.
So you think now the situation would change with this new methodologies you're introducing?
Yeah, indeed. And there's a tremendous amount of project activity in the AFLU space under the VCS. And the VCS has established itself as the go-to standard for AFLU projects. And we see we had a quick look at the number of methodologies. There are around 6 or 7 AFLU methodologies approved under the VCS already, and around 15 or 20 that are under development too. So it's certainly where people are bringing their AFLU projects at the moment. Even for the narrow scope that the CDM has, it still doesn't provide a high enough credit price to drive activity under the CDM.
Okay. Some other question? I myself might have a question also on the permanence of on the red credits. How would VCS handle whether the reduction makes a very reverse trend? Let's say there's a big fire on the forest, yeah, and really whatever was thought to be a reduction was no longer a reduction, and even we are worse than the benchmark for the project.
Yeah, yeah. So the way that the VCS is structured is to ensure that there are incentives for the project to come back and do re-verification on a regular basis. I mean, what you wouldn't want to have is a situation where somebody verified their reductions and they didn't come back to us ever again, because you wouldn't know what had happened at that project site. So you need to structure the way that this pooled buffer account works so that people are incentivized to come back to us and, if you like, let us know how they're doing. The way that works is that when you've issued credits, you pay them into the pooled buffer account. You then need to come back to the VCS and have a re-verification done within 5 years. If you don't have a re-verification done within 5 years, then half of the credits that you've had put into the pooled buffer account get cancelled. If you don't come back after 10 years, the remaining half will also get cancelled. And if you don't come back after 15 years, then we assume that there's been a complete reversal at the project site. So we make good from the pooled buffer account on all the VCUs that were issued as well. So you've had everything in the pooled buffer account for that project cancelled out, but also if it's issued 100,000 tons of VCUs as well, then we'll assume that those have been reversed, and there'll need to be a cancellation of a further 100,000 credits in the buffer account.
I see.